I'm Ella O'Neill, 36 years old, and I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps, a career I built from the ground up, starting as a private at 18. For years, I left the door open for my mother, a key to my house, access to my life, because it was easier than the fight. But while I was 6 months into a combat deployment overseas, she surrendered my retired military working dog, a Silver Star recipient, to a county animal shelter, and told me he was at the groomer. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you kept giving access to, no matter how many times they showed you who they were? Drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into everything that happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to draw a hard line after someone crossed one that should have been obvious, hit like and subscribe. What I did the morning after that dinner table changed everything. You'll want to hear it. I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, in a house that was tidy and well-ordered and full of a particular kind of quiet, the kind that settles in when one person decides how things are going to be and everyone else arranges themselves accordingly. My mother, Diane O'Neill, born 1957, ran that house the way a good teacher runs a classroom, with warmth, with precision, and with an absolute confidence that she already knew the answer before the question was asked. My father, Walter, born 1955, was a civil engineer who retreated to his study the way water finds the lowest available point. Not because he was cold, but because the study was the one room where no one needed anything from him. My brother Trent, 4 years older, born 1985, was the child my mother recognized. He was sociable and agreeable and willing to perform the version of himself that fit neatly into her expectations, and she rewarded this, quietly and consistently, for as long as I can remember. I was not that child, and I never would be. I was the one who brought home strays. I was the one who wanted to know how things worked, who argued back, who spent 3 hours sitting in the backyard with a neighbor's German Shepherd when I was 10 years old because it had gotten loose and was frightened, and I understood, with a certainty I couldn't have explained at that age, that the fastest way to move a frightened animal is to stop moving entirely and let it decide. My mother watched from the kitchen window during some portion of those 3 hours. She did not come outside. When the dog finally walked to me and let me take its collar, she tapped on the glass and pointed at my watch. I walked the dog home. I came back in for dinner. Nothing was said about it. When I was 14, I told Diane I wanted to be a soldier. She laughed, not cruelly, not dismissively in a way that would have started a fight, but lightly, the way you laugh at something you're certain is temporary. She changed the subject to something Trent had done at school that week, and I let her, because I had already learned that some decisions don't require her agreement. They just require you to keep quiet until you're old enough to execute them. My father had a civil engineer's relationship with conflict. He assessed load-bearing capacity and worked around points of stress rather than through them. He was not a cold man. He was, in certain ways, the warmer of my two parents. But warmth without backbone produces a particular kind of absence, and that absence shaped me as surely as anything Diane ever said directly. Trent was the easiest person in the house to understand. He had identified, early and perhaps unconsciously, that the path of least resistance in that family ran directly through Diane's expectations, and he had built his life along that path. By the time I was a teenager, he was already becoming what she had planned for: agreeable, sociable, oriented toward the kind of visible achievement that fits neatly into a conversation at a school fundraiser. I didn't resent him for it. I just understood that he had made a different calculation than I was going to make. That is the family I came from. I say this not to indict them and not to excuse them. I say it because accuracy matters, and the story I'm telling requires an accurate foundation. What happened in April of 2024 does not make sense without the 34 years that preceded it. When I was 16, I joined JROTC without telling my mother. I liked the structure of it. I liked that effort had a visible result, that rank was something you earned by performing rather than something bestowed because you'd made the right people comfortable. At school, I was a serious student, not in the direction Diane had hoped, which was pre-law or pre-medicine, something that would let her say a respectable word at the right dinners, but seriously, in the direction I was actually pointed. My fitness scores at graduation placed me in the top tier of my class. I had already visited the recruiter's office twice before I sat down and made it official. On a Tuesday afternoon in 2007, I signed the paperwork. I was 18 years old and I did not ask anyone's permission. I told Diane at dinner that night. She set her fork down with a particular precision, the kind that means something is being managed rather than expressed. My father said, "Well, that's something." Trent said nothing. There was a long silence, and then Diane did what she always does. She absorbed the information and reframed it on her own terms. In her version, she had advised me to think practically, and I hadn't listened. There was no fight. That's what I want you to understand about that family. There was never a fight. Just the long, quiet pressure of a woman with a fixed vision of what a good life looked like for a daughter, applied steadily and without interruption over years. I graduated boot camp at Paris Island in 2007 in the top quartile of my class. I called home from a payphone the evening after the ceremony. Diane asked if I was eating. There was no mention of the graduation itself, not what I'd achieved, not what it had taken, not what it meant. I laughed about it with my bunkmate that night in the barracks, because that was the only reasonable response to it. I was not hurt, not yet. I was too busy becoming something to spend time grieving what the people back home couldn't see. The Marine Corps didn't care who my mother thought I was. It only cared what I could do. I completed infantry support MOS training at Camp Pendleton in 2008 and was assigned to a unit there as a private first class, E2. The work suited me the way I had always suspected it would. In 2009, I was meritoriously promoted to Lance Corporal, E3, after high performance marks that put me near the top of my unit assessments. I was 20 years old and I was good at this, and I knew I was good at it, and that knowledge sat in me differently than any praise from Wilmington had ever managed to. But it was in 2009, on a particular afternoon at the base, that I first understood exactly which work I was meant for. A military working dog unit was running a training exercise on the other side of a chain-link fence. A Belgian Malinois entered a building and cleared it in 12 seconds flat. I stood at that fence for 40 minutes, watching the handlers run the dog through variations of the same drill. A handler eventually noticed and walked over. He spent 15 minutes explaining the program, the canine integration units, the MARSOC pipeline, the officer commissioning pathway that could get someone from where I was to where that work was done at the highest level. I listened to every word. Then I went to the base library and printed out the requirements for the Marine Corps Officer Commissioning Program. I did not call my mother. What I want you to understand about that afternoon is that it was not sentimental. I was not swept up in something. I saw a dog working the way I had never seen anything work, with no hesitation, no excess motion, no noise, just absolute purpose filling every second of those 12 seconds, and I recognized it. The way you recognize a language you've been hearing your whole life but never knew had a name. I have been chasing that feeling in my own career ever since. That fence line at Camp Pendleton was the pivot point. Everything before it was prologue. Everything after it was the job. At 20 years old, I sat at a library computer and printed out a stack of requirements I intended to meet. I had a direction. I had a plan. I had the particular calm that comes not from certainty about outcomes, but from certainty about direction, knowing which way you are pointed even when you cannot yet see the destination. I had a mother in Wilmington who was telling people at the right dinners that her daughter was going through a phase. She was not wrong that I was going through something. She was wrong about what it was. It was not a phase. It was the beginning of the record I have been building ever since, quietly, methodically, in a language she did not speak and would not learn until it was very nearly too late for the learning to matter. Over the next several years, I advanced quickly. The commissioning program led to officer candidate school at Quantico, which led to my commission as a second lieutenant, 1, in 2011. From there came Camp Lejeune, the MARSOC pipeline assessment, and eventually the Canine detachment assignment that had been the destination since that afternoon in 2009. The work was exactly what I had trained for, and I was good at it, and the Marine Corps confirmed this in the language it reserves for people doing the job correctly: promotion, selection, increased responsibility. I did not require Wilmington to confirm any of it. Through all of it, I kept a thread of contact with my family. I went back for holidays. I called with reasonable regularity. I don't know precisely why I kept returning to a table where I was reliably not included in the conversation. Habit, maybe. The particular stubbornness of someone who keeps sitting somewhere long after the reason for sitting there has expired. What I can tell you is that the warning signs accumulated slowly, the way they always do. A comment here, a redirect there, nothing dramatic, just the steady, low-level signal that I was not who she had planned for and was not becoming who she would have chosen. Thanksgiving of 2011. I drove to Wilmington after being commissioned as a second lieutenant. 1. My commission was real and recent, and I was proud of it in the quiet way. I was proud of things, which meant I didn't perform the pride, but I felt it. Trent was there with his new wife. He was 26, recently married, recently purchased a house, doing exactly what Diane had blueprinted, visibly, legibly, in ways she could describe at dinner. She spent most of the meal asking about the house, the wife's job, their plans for children. When I mentioned I'd been selected for the MARSOC pipeline assessment, she said, "Well, I hope you're being careful." Then she pivoted back to Trent. Walter caught my eye across the table. He said nothing. Trent's wife, to her credit, asked what MARSOC stood for. Nobody answered her. I drove the 2 hours back to base that night instead of staying over as I'd planned. Not in anger. I just didn't see the purpose in staying in a room organized entirely around someone else's priorities. She didn't insult me that night. She just didn't include me. After a while, that gets heavier than an argument would. In 2013, I completed the MARSOC assessment and was selected, still a first lieutenant, O2, and exactly where I had been working toward since 2009. I texted my mother the day of the selection. Selected. Starting pipeline. She responded 20 minutes later. Is that safe? I put the phone in my pocket. I didn't respond. I texted Walter instead, and he wrote back, "Proud of you, Elle." It was the first time he had said it in writing. I took a screenshot. I still have it, backed up to a hard drive in the bottom drawer of my desk at Camp Lejeune. I stopped needing her to be proud of me, somewhere around 24. What I didn't realize is that I'd replaced the need with a habit, the habit of proving it anyway, building the record anyway, showing up at the table anyway, as though persistence might eventually produce what approval never had. My first deployment came in 2014 as a Captain O3, leading a K9 element in full operational capacity for the first time. Before Wheels Up, I called home. Diane talked about a neighbor's kitchen renovation for 4 minutes before asking when I'd be back. I said I didn't know. She said, "Try to eat properly over there." I said I would. I hung up and went to work. That was the whole of it. Not a moment of recognition that her daughter was about to deploy in command of a team of people whose lives depended on the quality of her leadership. Just eat properly. The Corps taught me to trust the person next to me with my life. My family taught me to manage my expectations of the people back home. Both lessons were useful. One of them cost more. The Yemen deployment came in 2016. Before we deployed, my element was assigned a military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Atlas. He was handler certified, 6 years old, 3 prior deployments behind him, at the absolute peak of his ability. The handler who briefed me said, without any irony, "He's the best dog I've ever worked with. Don't let him get hurt." I spent 2 weeks in pre-deployment integration with Atlas. He was professional and precise and read a room the way good operators read a room, always ahead of the moment, always accounting for what was happening at the edges before the center registered it. On the 3rd night of integration, he slept outside my billet door. I checked once and then left him there. Atlas was a working dog. I say that the way soldiers say it, meaning he wasn't a pet, he wasn't a mascot, he was a partner, and he picked me as much as I picked him. In Yemen, during a night operation outside Aden, we walked into an ambush that went bad very fast. What Atlas did in that moment is described in his citation, which I will not summarize because it is not mine to summarize. What I will tell you is that when it was over, he came and pressed against my leg in the dark and his breathing was steady, and that steadiness was the thing that let me take the next breath and then the one after that. Some partnerships are not professional courtesies. They are something older and more reliable than that. He retired in 2017. I adopted him the same day. He was approximately 7 years old, and he had done more in those 7 years than most things twice his age. I took him home to Camp Lejeune and taught him, slowly, that we were not going anywhere that required either of us to be vigilant anymore. He learned it. It took him a while. It took me considerably longer. I did not send the photograph of us in pre-deployment gear to my mother. It was not that kind of photograph. It was a record, not a memory, documentation of 2 people about to go to work together in a place where the work was serious. The table in Wilmington had no frame of reference for it. I had stopped trying to find frames she could use. These are the years I want you to hold. 2011 through 2017, the years of accumulation. The years of the same quiet pressure, the same redirect, the same absence dressed as family warmth. And I kept returning, because I had not yet been given a reason clear enough to stop. That reason was coming. Atlas was asleep on my floor at Camp Lejeune, and the dinner table in Wilmington was still a place I visited occasionally and left early, reliably, and none of us named what was happening because naming it would have required someone to do something about it. It is April of 2024. I am 34 years old. I have just returned from a 6-month MARSOC deployment to the Indo-Pacific, my 4th deployment as a lieutenant colonel, 05. I have been home for 12 hours. There is a welcome home dinner at my parents' house in Wilmington. and I am driving there on a Saturday evening through the flat coastal geography I grew up in, and I am tired in the particular way that a long deployment produces, not sleepy, exactly, but hollowed out in a way that takes weeks to fill back in. My mother had been staying at my house at Camp Lejeune while I was gone. This was an arrangement we had fallen into gradually across several deployments. She would look after things, her phrase, and in practice this meant she had access to my house and my routines in my absence. I had found it more manageable than arguing about it. She had a key. She knew where things were. Atlas was not at the door when I came home the previous morning. The absence registered, it always registers, the particular quality of a space missing something that belongs in it. But Diane had texted me a week earlier to say she had put Atlas in the kennel for grooming, so he would be fresh for my homecoming. I accepted this without question. I was home after 6 months and I was tired and I had 12 hours before the family dinner and I needed the sleep more than I needed to think. I should have called the kennel. I want to say that plainly. I was home 12 hours and I didn't notice he was missing because my mother told me he was at the groomer, and I trusted her, and I was tired, and I am going to give myself exactly that much grace and no more. The dinner moved the way those dinners always moved. My father at the head of the table with polite questions about the deployment, to which I gave polite non-answers. Trent with his wife, oriented toward my mother, the way he always orients toward my mother. Diane steering conversation toward Trent's renovation project, toward a neighbor's situation, toward anything that fit the shape of the world she had arranged. The wine was poured, the food was served. I was quiet in the way I'm always quiet in that house, not withdrawn, just watchful, running the low-level situational assessment that 20 years of military service makes automatic. Then, midway through the main course, Diane set her glass down. She looked at me with a particular expression, not malicious, something almost proprietary, the expression of someone about to deliver a favor they are confident you will appreciate, and she said, "I got rid of that filthy dog while you were gone." "You're welcome." The table laughed, not cruelly. In the familiar way families laugh at a decision already made, a thing already settled, a topic that has already been discussed and dispensed with before the person most affected arrived at the room. Walter did not laugh, but he did not speak. Trent raised his wineglass in a gesture that was not quite a toast. His wife looked at the table. I went still. I have been in rooms where people were shooting at me, and I have been less afraid of what I might do next. I sat with the edge of the table under my hand, and I did what years of command training teaches you to do when the ground shifts without warning. I took inventory. I ran the sequence backward. Atlas was not at the groomer. Atlas had not been at the groomer. At some point in October of 2023, the day after I deployed, or close to it, my mother had surrendered my dog, a retired military working dog, a Silver Star recipient, a dog I had adopted on his retirement date and brought home and lived alongside for 7 years, to the new Hanover County Animal Shelter. She had told me, for 6 months, that he was being looked after. She had waited until I was seated at her dinner table with an audience to tell me what she had done. The table had been prepared before I walked in. The framing had been set. She had already won the room. The doorbell rang. I rose from the table. I walked to the front door and opened it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Jake Connor was standing on the porch in civilian clothes with Atlas on a short lead at his side. Jake Connor is a Navy SEAL, 8, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare Group, 2, out of Little Creek, Virginia. He was 41 that evening. He served alongside my MARSOC element during the Yemen deployment in 2016. He knew Atlas, by chip number, by deployment record, by the specifics of the citation that described what Atlas had done in the dark outside Aden. The previous afternoon, Connor had been conducting a routine community outreach visit to the new Hanover County Animal Shelter. In a back kennel, he spotted a Belgian Malinois. He scanned the microchip. The shelter told him the dog was scheduled for euthanasia at 0800 the following morning. Connor pulled Atlas at 0700, 1 hour before that appointment. He had located my homecoming date through our shared network of contacts. He had driven to Wilmington. Connor looked past Diane. He held up Atlas's service tags. His voice was level. "Ma'am, MWD Atlas, Silver Star, 5 deployments. We pulled him from the shelter an hour before they euthanized him." Diane's wineglass fell from her hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. Atlas slipped his lead. He crossed the foyer, moved through the dining room doorway, and pressed against my leg. I put one hand on his head and did not move it. I thanked Connor quietly. I invited him to stay for dinner. He declined but stepped inside long enough to hand over the lead and the service tags. He gave me a look, steady and level, with no pity in it and no performance, just the clear eye contact of a person who has confirmed, "I saw this, I handled it, here is what I recovered for you." Then he left. I walked Atlas to the chair beside mine and sat back down at the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at Diane. I finished my glass of water. I didn't yell. I have learned, in this job, that the moment you raise your voice at someone who deserves nothing from you, you've handed them the frame. You've made it about your reaction rather than their action. I was not going to do that. I was not going to give that table that version of events. Nobody spoke. The dinner did not resume. Atlas lay under the table with his chin on my foot. Diane's shattered wine glass remained on the floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. He pressed against my leg the way he always did after a bad day in the field. Like he knew exactly what had happened and had positioned himself accordingly. Maybe he did. I have never underestimated what he knows. The morning after the dinner, I moved with the clarity I have only ever found after a decision is already made and doesn't require further deliberation. I arranged the movers before breakfast. I did not call Diane to discuss it, because there was nothing to discuss. This was not a negotiation. It was a logistical action. I gave the moving company an address and a time, drove to Wilmington, and stood in the driveway of my parents' house, while two men pulled boxes of my belongings out of a garage where they had been stored, in my mother's care, for years. Walter came out to the porch with his coffee. He stood there a few minutes watching. Then he walked down the porch steps and stood beside me. He picked up one of my boxes and carried it to the truck himself. He was 69 years old and he carried a box down a driveway because it was the only concrete thing he knew how to do in that moment, and because some part of him understood that standing and watching was no longer sufficient. I noticed. I did not make it more than it was. He said, at some point while we were standing there, "I should have said something last night." I said, "Yeah." That was the whole of the conversation. 2 words on my end. It was the most honest exchange we had ever had, and it took less than 30 seconds, and 20 years of silence preceded it. My father carried one box, but he carried it. At 69 years old, he walked down those porch steps and he picked it up. I don't know what to do with that. I'm still not sure. Diane was inside the house. She did not come to the door. The drive back to Camp Lejeune was 2 hours south on Highway 17. Atlas had his head out the window for the first 30 minutes, then settled, then put his chin on the center console. I drove and did not call anyone, because what I needed was the particular processing that happens in motion, the after-action review that the Marine Corps trains you to run on any significant event. What happened? In what sequence? What I missed? What I should have seen earlier. I ran it without flinching, which is the only way it works. I've run a lot of after-action reviews. The debrief only works if you're honest. So here is the honest one. My mother has treated me like a problem to be managed since I was a teenager. Not out of malice, out of a fixed idea about what I was supposed to be, and a consistent refusal to revise that idea in the face of contrary evidence. I kept returning to her table. I kept bringing my dog. I kept sitting there and absorbing the quiet dismissal and leaving early and telling myself that persistence was a form of love. It was not love. It was just persistence. Those are 2 different things, and I had been confusing them for a very long time. Monday, I was back at work. Gunnery Sergeant Rosa Medina, 33 years old, E7, my senior NCO, the person who had run my detachment with precision through 6 months of my absence, debriefed me on the unit's status. She was thorough and clear, and when the official brief was finished, she closed the office door. She asked if I was all right. Not softly, in the way a senior NCO asks her commanding officer when the answer has bearing on how the unit runs. I told her what happened. Concisely. She listened the entire way through without interrupting. When I finish, she said, "Your mother surrendered a decorated MWD to a county shelter while you were deployed. That's not a family disagreement, ma'am. That's an action with consequences." She said it the way we talk about field decisions. I needed someone to say it in that language, and she understood that without being told. That evening, Trent called. He led with, "Mom is really upset." I let him finish the full sentence. Then I told him, in precise and moderate language, what Diane had done and what I intended going forward. He did what he has always done, defended her, reframed the incident as an overreaction on my part, suggested the dog had always been going to be a problem. "She just didn't want to deal with the dog while you were gone, Ella. You know how she is." I did know how she was. That was the problem. That had always been the problem. I listened until he was finished. Then I said, "We'll talk when you're ready to talk about what actually happened." I ended the call. Atlas was asleep on the couch and didn't move. I want to say something about the restraint of those first days. It was not passivity. It was the application of 20 years of training in a situation that required economy rather than expression. Raising my voice at that dinner table would have given Diane the narrative she could survive, the dramatic daughter, the disproportionate response. I did not give her that narrative. I gave her the accurate one, the one where she surrendered a combat-decorated dog to a county shelter while I was serving overseas and told me he was at the groomer. That is the story. I was not going to allow anyone in that room to replace it with a different one. Atlas shifted in his sleep that night. He made a small sound, not distress, just the sound of a dog dreaming. I watched him for a long moment, then turned off the lamp. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do. I did not draft a letter, stage a confrontation, or call a family meeting. The shape of this kind of story always seems to demand a scene, a reckoning, a visible moment of rupture. What I did instead was practical and total. I ended the arrangement that had given my mother access to my life. The open door, the spare key, the standing invitation to look after things while I was deployed. Those ended, cleanly and without drama, because they had always been the mechanism and I was no longer willing to maintain it. I called Diane on a weekday morning in late April, between PT and my first brief of the day. I kept the call to its necessary length. I stated 3 things. Atlas was home and was staying. The key to my house at Camp Lejeune had been changed, and if she wanted a relationship going forward, she needed to acknowledge what she had done, not apologize, necessarily, but acknowledge it as a real thing that happened to a real animal who had served this country and earned his retirement, not a logistical inconvenience she had helpfully resolved in my absence. Diane went quiet. Then she said I was being dramatic. Then she said she had done what she thought was best. Then she began to cry. I waited, through the crying. Then I said, "Okay, I'll be here when you're ready." I ended the call. "I'm not asking you to agree with me, Mom. I'm telling you what's changed." She cried. I understand that sounds, from outside it, like I should have felt something shift. But I've watched that maneuver my entire life. Tears in that house have always functioned as a subject change. The moment the argument is lost, the emotional register shifts, and the original topic becomes secondary to the distress that has replaced it. I had been the person who absorbed that shift and changed direction since I was a teenager. I was not going to do it again. The pressure campaign that followed was predictable. Trent called twice in 1 week, increasingly frustrated, increasingly committed to a version of events in which I had overreacted to a well-meaning gesture. He told me Diane was getting older. He told me this wasn't worth it. He said the dog was just a dog. Extended family members texted. One aunt left a voicemail that included the phrase, "She only did it because she loves you." I responded to none of them directly. I texted Trent the same sentence twice. "When you're ready to talk about what actually happened, I'm here." He did not acknowledge it either time. "It was just a dog, Ella. You need to let this go." He was not just a dog. He was MWD Atlas. He had a silver star and 5 deployments and a microchip registered to me and a legal adoption record. My mother surrendered him to a county shelter while I was serving overseas and told me, for 6 months, that he was fine. Those are the facts. The facts do not require softening in order for me to remain in relationship with the people who are uncomfortable with them. Walter called that week. This was different from Trent's calls. Walter did not defend Diane. He asked how I was. He said, "Your mother isn't going to apologize, Elle. You know that." I said I knew. He asked what I wanted, practically, going forward. I said I wanted to maintain a relationship with him. I said I would like a relationship with Diane too, eventually, but only one built on accurate history. He sighed the sigh of a man who has spent 40 years managing around something that finally has a name. He said he understood. He did not say he would do anything about it. I thanked him for calling. I meant it. He wasn't defending her. He was telling me the truth about who she was. He had known that truth longer than I had, and he was the first person in that family to say it to me plainly, and that was worth something. 2 months after the dinner, I was back in the field with my detachment running the training cycle. Atlas, retired, was permitted on the grounds. He moved along the perimeter wire with the ease of a dog who has spent his whole life inside military fences, knowing which spaces were his and comfortable in all of them. Gunnery Sergeant Medina watched him trot by one afternoon and said, without looking up from her clipboard, "Good call, bringing him back." I said, "Wasn't really a call." She nodded and went back to her notations, and we continued the training day. My professional life was intact. My command was intact. The rupture in Wilmington, though real, had not reached inside the gate. This was significant. What my mother had always had access to was the door I left open, the key, the spare room, the invitation to be present in my domestic life while I was away. She had no access to the work. She had never had access to the work, and the work was where I had always actually lived. Atlas sat at the edge of the training field one afternoon with his ears forward, watching a younger dog work a drill he had mastered a decade ago. I stood at the fence line with both hands in my pockets, and I was not thinking about Wilmington. The summer of 2024 passed the way good training cycle summers pass, with forward motion and demanding work and the particular satisfaction of a unit that knows what it's doing and does it. I ran the detachment. I worked with my handlers through the daily cycle of exercises and evaluations and the unglamorous administrative labor that keeps a special operations unit functional. I drove the long perimeter of the base on mornings when I needed to move. Atlas rode in the passenger seat. Walter called in July. He was checking in, which was new enough in its frequency to be worth noting. He had become more deliberate about calling since April, as though carrying a box down the driveway had released something in him that had been held for a long time. He mentioned, without drawing a conclusion from it, that Diane had not been herself. She had started a letter to me 3 times. She had said once that she hadn't realized Atlas was that kind of dog. Walter offered this the way he offers most information, plainly, without editorial, leaving me to determine what to do with it. I took the information and filed it. I did not read into it more than was there. I was not waiting for a letter. I was not waiting for anything. But I noticed, around this time, that I had stopped bracing for the next call. The low-level dread that had always accompanied my mother's number appearing on my screen had quieted to something I could set aside without effort. The unit's training cycle continued. Medina and I had developed a working rhythm over the years that was, by summer of 2024, efficient and easy in the way that good professional relationships become after 2 people have worked through something hard together and come out the other side, still trusting each other. We communicated in shorthand where shorthand was sufficient and in full sentences where it wasn't, and we had gotten each other through a difficult spring without making it harder than it had to be. Atlas had taken on an informal role among the younger dogs, not deliberately, just through proximity. The handlers noticed that his presence in the kennel yard had a settling effect when the younger animals were worked up after a hard exercise. One handler mentioned it during a debrief. Medina said, "Old dogs run quiet." I wrote it in my training notes because it was true in more than one direction. That was the summer I stopped carrying the argument in my head. Not because anything was resolved, it wasn't, but because I had finally put down something I had been holding for a very long time, and the absence of the weight was its own kind of answer. In August, I sat in my living room on an ordinary Tuesday evening with a book I hadn't opened yet and a glass of water. Atlas was asleep in the corner. I realized I had not thought about the dinner in Wilmington in 10 days. The recognition arrived the way the absence of a chronic noise arrives, as a mild surprise, and then as a relief you hadn't known to expect. I set the book down and took stock. The house was quiet. My leave request was approved. I had a training plan I was satisfied with. I was not at war with anyone in this room. I had carried that dinner table with me for months. And then one evening I looked up and it wasn't there anymore, not because I forgave anything, just because I'd finally set it down and taken a step away from it, and then another, and by August the distance was enough that I could no longer see it clearly from where I was standing. In September, I completed Gunnery Sergeant Medina's performance evaluation for the Master Sergeant 8 promotion board. I wrote it with the same care I give any document that will determine someone's trajectory, and I meant every word of it. Afterward, I thought about the officers who had written my evaluations in the years when I was coming up, the ones who saw me clearly and said so on paper, who put their professional credibility behind an accurate assessment of what I was doing and why it mattered. I had become that officer for Medina. The Marine Corps teaches you to evaluate without sentiment in the way of the truth, and to give the accurate assessment even when the easy assessment would be sufficient. I had tried to do that for the people under my command. I signed the evaluation, set the pen down, and looked out the window at the kennel yard. Atlas was in the sun by the fence. He was not doing anything in particular. He was just there, and in being there, he was exactly what he was supposed to be. The Marine Corps gave me something my family didn't, the ability to evaluate accurately, without sentiment in the way of the truth. I've tried to give that back. I'm still trying. There is no clean reconciliation. I want to establish that at the outset of this part, because the architecture of this kind of story always moves, in its telling, toward resolution. A conversation that restores something, a gesture that closes the account, a moment where the math balances. What the months after the dinner actually produced was more modest than that, and more durable. A careful renegotiation of what contact with my family was worth and on what terms. The terms were mine to set. I set them. In October of 2024, I I drove to Wilmington on a Saturday and met Walter for coffee at a shop on Market Street, not at the family house, because I was not yet ready to go back into that house, and Walter understood this without needing it explained. We talked for 90 minutes. We talked about my childhood in a way we had never talked about it before, not to relitigate the specific incidents, but to place the overall shape of it accurately, the way you place a datum point on a map so you can navigate forward from a known position. Walter said that he had known early that I was different from what Diane expected, and that he had not intervened the way he should have. He used the word should. Coming from a man who had spent decades declining to use that word in any form, it carried weight. I accepted it. I did not give him more credit than he had earned, but I did not diminish it either. We split the check. He hugged me at my car. Atlas was in the passenger seat and watched Walter through the window. Walter knocked on the glass. Atlas's ears came forward. He was 69 years old, and he was honest with me for what felt like the first time in a sustained and deliberate way. I decided that counted for something. I'm still deciding how much. In November, Trent called and did not lead with my mother. He asked how I was doing, and it was an actual question, rather than a preface to a redirect. He was quiet on the phone, in a way he hadn't been before. He said, eventually, that he had thought about the dinner. He said he shouldn't have laughed. He did not offer a full accounting of his role, didn't describe the weeks before the dinner when he must have known what Diane had done, didn't address the years of reflexive alignment that had made Diane's behavior possible in the first place. But he said he shouldn't have laughed, and he said it plainly, and I accepted it for what it was, not a reckoning, but the beginning of one. I shouldn't have laughed, at the table. I want to say that. It wasn't everything, it was the beginning of something. I'll take a beginning. In December, the detachment held its end-of-year gathering. Informal food, lights strung around the kennel fence, the dogs out in the yard, the easy warmth of a unit that has spent a hard year doing good work together. Atlas moved through the room at the measured pace of a 14-year-old dog who has been in enough rooms to know there is no hurry. He was greeted by name by handlers who had not been there for Yemen, who knew him only by the record he had left. The Silver Star citation, the deployment count, the story that had spread through the unit the way stories spread in military communities, accurately and with appropriate weight. He was met with the deference the force extends to those who have done the hardest version of the work, and he accepted it with the dignity of an animal that has never needed to perform anything. He worked that room like a senior NCO at a change of command, unhurried, thorough. He knew exactly where he belonged. Walter called in December with one final piece of information for the year, delivered without editorial. Diane had asked him what Atlas's service record was, specifically what the Silver Star was for. He told her. The next day she found the citation online and read it. She did not say what she thought after reading it. She closed her laptop and went to make dinner. Walter mentioned this to me because he thought I should know she was finding her way toward the truth of it on her own terms and in her own time. I listened. I said, okay. I meant it as exactly what it was. Acknowledgement that the information had arrived and been received. Nothing more and nothing less. I didn't need her to understand it years ago. I needed her to understand it was real. She was getting there. On her own time, without my management of it, which was the only way any of it was going to mean something. That was going to have to be enough, because it was what there was. A photograph of Atlas at the holiday gathering, asleep under a table, a paper plate of something he wasn't supposed to have somewhere near his nose. I sent it to Walter. He sent back a single thumbs up. I put my phone in my pocket and went back to the party. It is early 2025. I am 35 years old, approaching 36 by the calendar math from 1989. The year since the welcome home dinner has not been uncomplicated, but it has been clarifying in the way I find most things clarifying. When I finally stop arguing with what I already know and allow myself to simply know it, the noise that followed me out of every O'Neill family dinner for 2 decades, that low-level frequency of not being quite included, of being managed rather than seen, has quieted. Not because it was resolved, because I put enough distance between myself and the source of it that I can no longer hear it clearly. In January, a new handler class ran its first live exercise at the detachment. I watched from the observation point with Medina, who was by then working through the paperwork pipeline for her Master Sergeant promotion board. We talked about the cohort, who was tracking ahead of schedule, who needed another rotation to solidify the foundational skills, who had the instincts that training can sharpen but cannot create from nothing. The conversation was professional and easy and warm in the way that conversations become after 2 people have worked through something difficult together and emerged from it still trusting each other. At one point, with no particular preamble, Medina said, You seem different this year. I considered it for a moment. I said, I think I finally stopped arguing with something I already knew. That is the most accurate thing I have found to say about it. The shift was not dramatic. It arrived without announcement, the way most real changes arrive, and the only way I knew it had happened was by noticing that something that had required effort no longer did. In February, I found Diane's letter in a stack of mail I had been slow to open since returning from a training TDY. The envelope was handwritten, her careful, looping schoolteacher's script, the penmanship of a woman who learned to write in an era when it meant something. She had written my name on the envelope with a particular attention I recognized immediately, the same attention she had always given to official forms and things that were meant to last. I set it on the kitchen counter. I made coffee. Atlas sat by the back door, watching a squirrel with the patient professional attention of an animal for whom stillness has always been a skill rather than an absence of action. I looked at the letter once more. I put it in the drawer. I know her handwriting. I put the letter in the drawer because I was not ready for what was inside it, and I have learned, over years of running operations that require you to read a situation accurately before you act on it, that reading something before you are ready to hold its contents is its own kind of failure. I would read it when I was ready. I was not ready yet. In March, Jake Connor called from Little Creek. We are not close friends. Our relationship is the particular kind of professional warmth that builds between operators who have been in the field together in difficult circumstances, and both came home. He asked about Atlas. I said he was doing well. Connor said he was glad. He mentioned a joint MARSOC NSW exercise coming up in late April, his element and mine, same training range. He said Atlas would be welcome if I wanted to bring him. I said I'd think about it. I did not say, you saved his life, so of course I'm bringing him. I didn't need to say it, and Connor wouldn't have wanted me to. He'd saved my dog's life, and he was offering it as a simple professional courtesy, without expectation of acknowledgement, without any need for the gesture to be made larger than it was. That's the kind of man Jake Connor is. I've worked with enough of the other kind to recognize the difference immediately, and to understand how rare the first kind actually is. In April, at the end of a long administrative day, I sat in my office with the training schedule for the joint exercise 3 weeks out. Through the window, I could see the kennel yard. I was 35, approaching 36. I thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer, not with dread, not with resistance, with the quiet attention of someone who knows something is waiting and has made her peace with the waiting. The exercise was 3 weeks out. I would bring Atlas. And at some point, I would open the drawer. There are things I still don't know. I don't know what my mother wrote in that letter. I don't know whether she understands what she took, or whether she's apologizing for something smaller than the actual weight of it. I don't know yet if any of it will change what comes next. What I know is that I'm not afraid of the answer anymore. That is a different relationship with the unknown than I have had before. I'm waiting for the right morning, and the right morning will come. Through the office window, Atlas reached the fence line and sat. He looked out at whatever was beyond the perimeter. I watched him from the desk and wondered, not for the first time, if that was what peace looks like when it arrives without fanfare. The joint MARSOC NSW exercise runs for 5 days in late April of 2025. I am 36 years old. I drove to the training range with Atlas in the passenger seat and my kit in the back, and somewhere inside that kit, in the exterior pocket beside my field notebook, was a handwritten envelope I had not yet opened. The first morning, Connor and I ran the joint brief together. We were the senior leads for our respective elements, and it was clean and efficient. 2 people who understand how to work in the same room without friction, who have enough shared context to communicate in the necessary shorthand, and enough mutual respect to not require anything beyond it. After the brief, Connor introduced Atlas to the NSW element. He did it simply, without being asked, without theatrics. He said, "That's MWD Atlas, Silver Star, 5 deployments, retired 2017. He's the reason we're running this exercise today." Several members of the NSW element who had not known the full history received the information and filed it without comment, which is the appropriate response, and the one you learn to recognize as the highest form of acknowledgement in the community of people who do this work. One of the younger SEAL candidates crouched down to Atlas's level, looked at the tags hanging at his collar, and said, "Hoo-yah, Atlas." He said it quietly and sincerely. Atlas accepted it. His ears came forward once, briefly, and then he settled back into the measured stillness he has perfected over 14 years of knowing exactly what is required of him in any given room. He didn't say it for me. He said it because it was true. In Connor's world, accuracy is the highest form of respect. I have always understood that. It is why I trust his judgment, and why I knew, when he handed Atlas back to me on my parents' porch in the dark a year before, that he had not done it for praise or recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing. And because in his accounting of the world, that is sufficient reason. On the fourth morning of the exercise, I woke before 0500, which was not unusual. I had brought the letter in my kit without fully deciding to bring it. I sat in the gray pre-dawn quiet of my quarters on the training range, and I took the envelope out of the exterior pocket and I opened it. Diane's letter was 2 pages. It was written in her careful hand, more formal than her usual correspondence, in the way people write when they are trying to get something exactly right, rather than simply said. She wrote that she had looked up Atlas's Silver Star citation after Walter told her what it was for, the full citation, not a summary, the official language that describes precisely what he did and when and under what conditions. She wrote that she understood, reading it, what kind of dog he was, not a pet who happened to have military tags. A working partner who had done something extraordinary in the dark outside a Yemeni city and had the official documentation of a government that takes those things seriously to prove it. She wrote that she understood for the first time what it meant that I was the one who was with him when it happened, what the years that led to that moment had cost, and what they had produced. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote it plainly and without qualification, without excusing what she had done and without asking me to minimize it. She wrote that she knew an apology did not restore 6 months of absence, did not undo the 10 years of dismissal that preceded it, did not change the fact of what she had done to an animal who had given everything he had and deserved better than a county shelter kennel. She wrote that she was not asking me to forgive her. She was asking me to know that she had looked, finally and honestly, at what I actually was, not the version of me she had been managing for 34 years, but the actual thing, the whole record. The last line of the letter read, "I didn't understand what you were. I think I do now." I read it twice. I set it on the cot beside me. Atlas came through the tent flap, circled once with the deliberate efficiency of a dog who has slept in hundreds of temporary spaces and knows how to make any of them his, and lay down against my feet. She didn't say what she thought I was. Maybe she didn't have the words for it yet. Maybe that's fine. It's enough to know she looked. It's enough to know she went and found the citation and read the whole thing and sat with what it contained, and that what she felt when she finished reading it was something she needed to write down and send. On the fourth afternoon, there was a lull between rotations. Connor and I stood at the range line with coffee, watching the next team prep for their run. Atlas was in the shade behind us. I told Connor I had read the letter. He didn't push, just nodded once, I said. She finally looked up the citation. Connor said, "Good." That was all. We watched the next rotation move out. The work continued. In my line of work, good carries a specific weight. It means, that's what was supposed to happen. It took longer than it should have, but it happened. We can proceed from here. 12. I have rarely heard a more useful word in a more useful context, said by a more useful person. The exercise wrapped at the end of the 5th day. I drove south on the highway toward Camp Lejeune with Atlas in the passenger seat and the windows down. He had his head out the window for the first hour, which is exactly what he does on every long drive, and the sight of it, this dog, 14 years old, Silver Star, 5 deployments, head out the window of my truck on a spring afternoon in North Carolina like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, was something I let myself feel without trying to name it. Some things don't need names. They just need to be noticed. I thought about Connor at the range line, saying one word that contained a whole sentence. I thought about Walter carrying a box down the driveway at 69, the slow deliberateness of a man who had finally decided that witnessing without acting was no longer a position he could hold. I thought about Medina with her clipboard saying, "Old dogs run quiet," and meaning more than one thing by it. I thought about a SEAL candidate crouching down to say "hoo-yah" to a retired Malinois and meaning every syllable. I thought about the woman I had been building, quietly, since I was 18 years old and walked into a recruiter's office on a Tuesday afternoon without asking permission. I thought about the fence line at Camp Pendleton and the 12 seconds that told me what my whole life was going to be pointed toward. I didn't walk away from my family. I walked toward myself. Those are 2 different roads, even when they look like the same one for a while. Atlas pulled his head inside the window. He circled once in the passenger seat, settled, and put his chin on my thigh. I rested one hand on his head without taking my eyes off the road. The highway opened ahead, long and straight and certain, and I was 36 years old, and I was a lieutenant colonel with a record that spoke without my help. And I had a dog with a Silver Star who was shedding Belgian Malinois fur all over my passenger seat, and I was not waiting for anything anymore. If you are waiting for someone to see you correctly before you allow yourself to be correct, stop waiting. Build the record anyway. Do the work anyway. Show up for the people next to you. The way Connor showed up, the way Medina showed up, the way a 14-year-old Belgian Malinois pressed against your leg in a dining room and reminded you that some things do not require explanation. The citation writes itself. All you have to do is show up. Atlas settled deeper into the seat. His breathing slowed to the even cadence of a dog at rest, in motion, in the company of someone he trusts. The highway ran south. I kept both hands on the wheel. I kept driving. The road ahead was long, and I had nowhere to be except exactly where I was, and that was enough. That had always been enough. I just needed long enough to know it. That's the full story. Atlas is home, the door is closed, and I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. If this story hit home for you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had someone in your life who reframed every choice you made as a problem to be managed? Have you ever kept returning to a table that had no real seat for you, and what finally made you stop? Or maybe you had your own Jake Connor, someone who showed up without being asked and did the right thing simply because it was right. Tell me about them. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your integrity, you already know what this story is really about. It's not about the dog. It's about what happens when you finally stop arguing with something you've always known. Like this video if you believe that loyalty has to go both ways, and subscribe if you want more stories about real people who made hard calls and didn't look back. Share it with someone who needs to hear that walking away from what diminishes you is not giving up. It's showing up for yourself. Finally, after a very long time, Atlas is asleep on the couch right now. He doesn't know he's the reason any of this got said out loud. That tracks. The best ones never do.